Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. WikiLeaks has struck again, and it's a big one. It's exposed a huge volume of CIA hacking secrets. You'd think this would be a massive news story, but the political establishment remains obsessed with chasing the ghosts of supposed Russian hacking and Obama-era wiretaps. We'll talk about this new development in just a minute. But first tonight, the Republican replacement for Obamacare could already be in trouble. Well, the American Health Care Act is one that supported President Trump. Some conservatives in the Congress have already called it Obamacare Light. Some are calling it Obamacare 2.0. Moderates are mad the bill will defund Planned Parenthood temporarily. And, of course, Democrats have no interest at all in gutting the former president's signature accomplishment. Who loves this bill? Does it have hope of becoming law? We're joined now by Republican Congressman Buddy Carter of Georgia. He supports the new bill. Congressman, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you.
So like a lot of people paying attention, I've been spending a lot of the day trying to figure out what this bill says, what the implications are. And some of it seems good, some of it I don't fully understand. But I keep thinking, it's been 7 years. Is this the best that Congress can produce after all those years of promising to replace Obamacare with something better?
Well, first of all, let's keep in mind that this is the first step. There are other steps that we have to go through. This is what we're doing in reconciliation. This is what the first bucket looks like. We describe it as 3 buckets. We still got 2 buckets left before we have our final product. But this is a very important part of, especially of the repeal process. And let's face it, Tucker, we've got to do something. I mean, Obamacare is imploding. This is something that responsible people and members of Congress, we understand that we've got to rescue health care, and that's what we're trying to do.
I think most people agree with you, and that's why Republicans control both houses of both chambers, and that's why they control the majority of governorships and state legislatures and the White House, in part because they've told their voters, look, this is a disaster, Obamacare. It's never gotten majority support. We're going to give you something better. And so the question remains, why is it a multi-step process? Why does it seem so disorganized? Why wasn't it ready to go a month and a half ago?
Well, it has been ready. If you remember, we rolled out our Better Way plan, and in that we gave the major ideas of what we wanted to do. We want to have more accessible, more affordable, patient-centered health care. Listen, I'm the only pharmacist currently serving in Congress. I was a health care professional in my professional life, and I know how personal health care is. I know how important it is to people, and it's important that we have competition and choices in health care. Right now, we don't have that with Obamacare. You know, just this weekend in Tennessee, we found out that we're going to have 16 counties don't have any choice whatsoever. We've got...
And that's clearly bad. I mean, I don't think it answers the question after 7 years why it's not fully ready to go. But let's get to the specifics here. So the individual mandate is very unpopular. Polling has showed that consistently over all these years. This is Rand Paul, Senator Paul of Kentucky's assessment of your bill. He said it keeps the individual mandate but makes you pay insurance companies, not the government. So there's still a requirement to buy insurance in this, correct?
Well, no, not at all. What we're doing, instead of penalizing people and taxing them for not having insurance, what we're going to do is we're going to reward them with a tax credit for having insurance. Now, I suspect what Senator Paul is talking about there is the refundable tax credits. And what that is intended to do is to make sure those people who don't necessarily benefit from a tax credit, that they can get the tax credit automatically and then buy insurance with it. That's what we intend for that to do.
Okay, so there's no penalty at all. If I'm what used to be called a free rider and don't feel like getting insurance and continue to go to the emergency room for my health care, that's okay. There's no penalty at all for me.
Well, there's not a penalty, but what we're going to do, again...
There's no extra cost for me.
Well, no, except that you don't have insurance. And you know, what we're trying to do, we're not trying to be punitive here. What we're trying to do is reward and to empower people. That's the key.
Right. Of course, I get all that. But here's the central problem that Obamacare tried to tackle. I think it did a bad job, but it's still a problem, which is that the older segment of the population, which is also the richest, by the way, consumes the overwhelming majority of health care dollars. The youngest segment doesn't want to buy insurance because they perceive that they don't need it, and most of them actually don't. You need to get them, the healthy, to pay for the sick in order for it to work. Hence the individual mandate. This bill doesn't answer that problem at all?
No, well, we don't, unlike Obamacare, we don't want to discriminate. We don't want to discriminate, and we're not going to. And what we're trying to do, again, is to empower people. We feel like that people who are able to make their own health care choices do a better job than this cookie-cutter approach that Washington, D.C. thinks that we know best and we can tell you what you need in health care. That simply is not working.
So if my kids or anyone's kids decide, you know what, I'm 27 years old, I can no longer ride along with my parents' insurance policy, I don't feel like getting insured, The government has nothing to say about that. No one's going to force them to do that.
Well, that has been the punitive nature of
right. Okay,
Obamacare.
I just want to be clear on it because there's a lot of debate about what this legislation actually says. So the ban on insurance companies discriminating against those with pre-existing conditions stands, as does the ban on lifetime limits that insurance companies posed on patients. How is it insurance exactly if we're requiring insurance companies to insure people whose policies they are certain will lose money? That's not really insurance, is it? It's something else.
No, and listen, the insurance companies are going to be a big part of this. We've got to see what products they're going to come out with, and those products are going to be important into what the market will bear and what the market needs, and I'm sure that's what they will come out with.
Okay, but you can't run an insurance. I mean, insurance is a bet, right? That you'll pay more to them than they will pay you in the end, right? It's based on a wager that they make. That's what insurance is.
Right.
But if the government says you have to take people on whom you know you will lose money, then by definition those insurance companies need government subsidies or they fail, right?
Well, we're one of the big stalwarts of our plan is Medicaid reform. We know that this is, listen, you know, this has been called Obamacare. It should have been called Obamacade. Out of the 3/4 of the people who have been added to the insurance rolls have been added to Medicaid through Medicaid expansion.
Right.
Medicaid was never intended to be for able-bodied adults. It was always intended to be a safety net for those who need it the most, for the aged, the blind, the disabled, the children who need it the most. But instead, it's turned out to be through Obamacare as for able-bodied adults. We've got to address that. We've got to get Medicaid back. And we've got to pass the responsibility and partner with the states. They can do a much more efficient, much more effective job than we can do.
Well, maybe. I mean, they're pretty good at fleecing the federal government, I noticed. But if you talk to any governor, anybody involved in Medicaid in the states, and they're honest with you, they'll say that non-citizens account for a big proportion, in some states, a big proportion of their spending on Medicaid. It's not a small thing at all. It's not just like some right-wing hobby horse. It's a real thing. What does this legislation do to prevent people who aren't here legally, who are not citizens, from taking advantage of the largesse of the government?
Well, again, what this legislation does, those people won't be getting tax credits. Obviously, those people aren't filling out tax forms, and they're not filling out to get a tax rebate or anything, so they're not going to be benefiting from any kind of tax credits at all.
Federally, but they can still ride along and use the state Medicaid, right?
Well,
is there anything in here that says that people here legally cannot take advantage of this program?
Well, I think that's incumbent upon the states to make sure that's not happening.
But some states won't do that. I mean, New York, California, they're not going to prevent illegals from using this, and that's okay?
Well, no, it's not okay. Not in my mind, at least.
Right, but does the legislation address it? I guess that's what I mean.
Not that I'm aware of, but I do know that it does leave that up to the states to be monitored by the states.
Obamacare taxes are still in here, and not all of them will be repealed. The bulk won't be repealed until 2018. Why is that?
Right. Well, one of the things that we promised is a stable transition period. In order to have that stable transition period, we've got to make sure people, because everyone's concerned, and I get it. Listen, I had town hall meetings, and they expressed to me how concerned they were about it, and I get that and understand that health care is personal. But we promised we're not going to yank the rug out from underneath anyone. In order to do that, we've got to have a glide path, if you will. We've got to have a stable transition period. This didn't happen overnight. It's not going to change overnight.
What does this cost? And how many people will lose their coverage as a result?
Well, two things. First of all, we haven't gotten the cost estimates back yet from the CBO.
But I mean, well, of course, it hasn't been scored officially. Right. But I mean, you're not going to release something like this to the public without giving us some sense of its costs.
Well, we feel like we can make it, especially over a period of time. We feel like we can bring down health care costs. We feel like
by how much over what period?
Well, that remains to be seen. But if we increase competition, if we increase choices, if we increase patient responsibility, then we will be able to bring.
Wait, I mean, I don't want to be a jerk about it or press you too hard or anything, but I mean, this is the story of the day. This affects everybody in the country, 330 million. And so you got to give us some sense of what it's going to cost, where the money's going to come from, who's going to lose coverage. I mean, you're rolling it out today. What's the answer?
Right. Well, the answer is that we're going to create a market that in healthcare that's going to be much more competitive. It's going to have more choices. It's going to be patient-centered. And that's going to create a market that will be much more affordable to people.
How much more?
That remains to be seen. I mean, I can't give you a figure that tells you this is how much it's going to save.
So when Nancy Pelosi says lots of people are going to lose their health insurance because of this, what's your response?
My response is just the opposite. I think people are going to have access to health care and better health care, and they're going to be empowered in their health care.
So people are not going to lose their health insurance because of this?
It will be accessible. They will have the opportunity to have health care. I can assure you
Can you
of that.
see why this makes people nervous if you roll something out without any details? I mean, look, I'm not against it. I just want to know what the details are.
I understand. But again, that's why we want to make sure we have a stable transition period. If you will note, when Tom Price became Secretary of Health and Human Services, the first thing he did when he got into office was to shore up the Affordable Care Act to make sure that it can last us through this transition period.
All right. Congressman Carter, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We've got a Fox News alert for you. The state of Hawaii has announced it will challenge the Trump administration's revised executive order, the one that blocked travel from 6 nations, mostly in the Middle East. That lawsuit, which will be filed tomorrow, is the first of what may likely be many challenges to the new order, which is designed to better withstand legal scrutiny. We're going to keep you updated on this developing story as we get more details. Much like members of a deluded cult, once the Washington establishment decides a scandal exists, no one can ever be convinced that it's bogus, all of it. Well, today, Democrats in Congress are demanding the appointment of a special counsel to investigate claims of Russian interference in the 2016 election, even though, as of tonight, no evidence of criminal interference has ever appeared, to put it clearly. Well, similarly, the Trump administration will not retract its claim that President Obama wiretapped the campaign, but also will not offer any evidence that it actually happened. Has fake news been joined by fake scandals? We're joined now by Fox News senior political analyst Britt Hume. Hey, Britt.
Hi, Tucker.
So if you're able to kind of drown out all the noise surrounding this Russia story, what's it really about at its core?
Well, this is fascinating in a way, because if you step back from it a little bit and you look at all that's been generated here, which is to say, we have a congressional investigation going on by the House Intelligence Committee and perhaps other committees as well. We have an attorney general who has recused himself from any Justice Department investigations involving this matter. We have the calls now, as you just pointed out, for the appointment of a special prosecutor or a special counsel to carry out a supposedly independent investigation of this whole matter. And when you boil the whole matter down, it comes down to 2 parts. One is the Russians' attempts to interfere in the presidential campaign. There's really no evidence they interfered in the election itself, that is to say in the voting and the activities that take place surrounding that. So, and I think there is some indication the Russians tried to influence the campaign, most conspicuously by John Podesta's emails that were hacked and then leaked to the public, most of which were embarrassing, but there's no real sign that they had any decisive effect on the campaign. And that's part of it. The other part of it is the notion that there was collusion between the Trump campaign, as you pointed out, and the Russians. There is, so far as I can see, absolutely no evidence to that effect. None whatever. Yes, there's evidence that there may have been some contacts between people associated with the Trump campaign in some way and Russian officials. No evidence that any of that was improper, inappropriate, or in any way related to campaign activities. So basically, we have an investigation which is rooted in something of which there is no evidence. Now, similarly, as you point out, the president's claim made over the weekend in his tweets that Obama ordered him wiretapped, or had him wiretapped, as he put it in one of his tweets. There's no evidence for that either. So we have this tremendous stir going on, and the media are really pressing very hard to get the Trump White House to answer for this claim that the president made, for which there appears to be no substantiation. In the meantime, of course, the media are merrily covering, with very serious and sober faces, this whole set of inquiries and so on that are going on into this possibility of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, which, as I say, and as you pointed out, there is absolutely no evidence. It is kind of a remarkable feat of political alchemy by the Democratic Party and its friends in the media to turn nothing into something.
Well, and there are, of course, legitimate criticisms of how the administration has behaved. This just isn't one of them. But meanwhile, while the scandal may be imaginary, Russia is a real country with nuclear weapons and a population over 100 million, and it's a player in the world, especially in Europe. What's the effect of all this on Russia, the actual place, and our relationship with it?
Well, this seems to me to be, kind of an irrelevancy that may become an obstacle in relations with Russia. It does seem to me, Tucker, pretty clear that part of the suspicion about this that has been raised, and that's all it is a suspicion, is rooted in the fact that President Trump had said during the campaign, and perhaps since as well, some rather kind things about Vladimir Putin, and suggested more than once that he could establish a working relationship with Putin in which we would be allies in the fight against ISIS and perhaps in other things as well. that proposition that there can be this alliance seems to be somewhat in tatters right now. You have his UN ambassador more than once has been very critical of Russia publicly, and as far as we know, with his approval. And he has said himself as well that he doesn't know whether he would be able to have a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. He thinks he might not be able to, but he thinks it would be good if he did. Well, all that seems at this point rather innocent to me. So the question then arises is, how do we deal with Russia and the problems Russia causes around the world, and especially, as you note, in Europe? And that remains a wide open question, but that seems to be pretty much in the hands of people like Rex Tillerson and James Mattis and the people at the CIA, Mike Pompeo, and so on. So I don't think there's yet any reason to worry that there might be some inappropriately soft relationship between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. I don't think there's much of a relationship at all at this stage.
Doesn't seem like there is. So really quickly, to the wiretapping question, we know that people around Trump were surveilled by the U.S. government, Michael Flynn maybe among others. The president is in charge of the CIA. They're his employees. He's their supervisor. What prevents the White House from getting to the bottom of this fairly quickly and presenting the evidence?
Well, here's a couple of things to remember about this. This strikes me that such wiretaps as there were not related to some domestic investigation, but were a foreign policy matter, national security investigation. That requires a warrant from the so-called Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, which has to look at the possibility that there's probable cause and then issue it. Such warrants are not to be issued except in the rarest of circumstances against citizens of the United States, which does not, of course, preclude the possibility that in intercepting the phone calls, for example, of the Russian ambassador in Washington, that conversations with people close to Donald Trump might have occurred, as we believe we know they did in the case of General Flynn, who then proceeded to mislead the vice president about those conversations. The reason we know about them is there had to have been surveillance of the Russian ambassador, and Mr. Flynn, General Flynn, caught up in that. So we know that that happened. We also know that there was probably a criminal leak of that information, which is why we know about it.
Well, exactly.
But all of this is and the idea that a president would be able to cause a wiretap to occur, which is legally not supposed to occur without the permission of a court, seems a touch far-fetched. And there's certainly no evidence that President Obama actually caused this to happen. Now, I know there are people that think that, he gives a wink and a nod to the right people and that these things would not go on without his knowledge. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think these kind of things can go on without his knowledge, at least up until the point when intelligence is obtained thereby, which is then presented to him in the form of an intelligence report. But these agencies operate not entirely on their own, obviously. He's responsible for all of them, and they're responsive to him.
Right,
but he's not. Autonomy. He's simply. I mean, I don't know of a case when a president has ever been known to have ordered a wiretap.
Britt Hume, joining us live. Thanks a lot, Britt.
Bet.
WikiLeaks may have done more than any other organization last year to destroy the Clinton campaign, thanks to the release of their massive trove of Democratic Party emails. Now they're trying to claim yet another scalp, the CIA. For more, we are joined tonight by Fox News correspondent Trace Gallagher. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker, unlike the Edward Snowden leaks back in 2013 that revealed the National Security Agency was, in fact, spying on average Americans, today's document dump by WikiLeaks isn't about gathering info on Americans. It's about the tools and tactics being used by the Central Intelligence Agency to break into or circumvent various communication technologies. For example, experts who studied the leaked documents say the CIA, along with other U.S. and foreign agencies, found a way to hack into phones that use Google's Android technology, giving them the ability to collect voice and text message data from messaging apps like WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal. Experts say it appears the CIA was able to hack devices prior to the encryption or secret code being applied. Google is looking into the matter, but it's interesting that one cybersecurity expert here in California says it appears that CIA hackers would cover their tracks by leaving electronic trails suggesting the hacks came from Iran, China, or Russia instead of the United States. It also appears that U.S. and British intel agencies developed a way to take controls of televisions connected to the internet, making it appear the TV was off when in fact it was recording conversations in the room. WikiLeaks reportedly admits the documents came from within the CIA, and that is a problem. Listen.
I just spoke to a former CIA officer who told me that this was really bad. He said that there would be a serious reckoning within the CIA, and he seemed to be surprised if there weren't. He said he would be surprised if people didn't lose their jobs over this.
And it's no secret the U.S., its allies and adversaries are all trying to figure out ways to exploit the flaws in new technology. Today's leaks are just laying that out for us in detail. And WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange says there is more to come. Tucker.
You can bet on that. Trace Gallagher. Thanks, Trace. Well, last week, protesters ruined a speech by Charles Murray at Middlebury College. Up next, we'll talk to a longtime Middlebury professor who is taking a stand on behalf of freedom of speech on campus. Stay tuned. Well, rural America is clearly voting conservative. They didn't always, but they do now. Why is that? Take a look at the state of California. It was the bluest state, of course, in the 2016 election. But not every part of the state is Democratic. Many counties in the state's Central Valley voted big numbers for Donald Trump. Victor Davis Hanson is a classics scholar and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, based at Stanford University. He's also a farmer in the Central Valley, and he just wrote a piece entitled Why the Central Valley Votes More Conservative, where he described the 2016 election as a revolt by the forgotten masses against the elites. It was a revolt, he said, against, quote, a world where walls on the border are proof of ignorant xenophobia, gates and walls around private Tony residences are logical measures to ensure security. Professor Hanson joins us now. Professor, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So how would you summarize, so what is the core cultural difference that creates the political divide between rural and urban voters?
I think it has a lot to do with speech and deeds, thought and action. That people in the country, they tend to be a little bit more isolated, and how they dress or how they sound are not as important as what they do. So we've gone now a half century with this best and brightest paradigm where your zip code or your income or the brand of education that you're stamped with is supposed to mean something, and we take that for granted. And people out in the country tend to be a little bit more autonomous. They pump their own water, they deal with their own sewage. So a man or a woman that can repair a hydraulic ram in 10 minutes or get on their belly and take out a transmission, that takes a lot of skill, and it takes a lot of intelligence and ingenuity. And we haven't valued that because we are in this paradigm. You leave this Tony prep school, then you go to an Ivy League or a Stanford, and then you get branded, you go to DuPont Circle, Upper West Side, and we consider you wise. And the people in the interior said, well, wait a minute. We're $20 trillion in debt. You can't speak on a campus without being shouted down. We've got the worst economic growth. Who are you smart guys that gave us that?
Exactly.
We didn't do it. Somebody did. And so I think that they want to judge people with what they do rather than what they say or how they look.
And there's also the point that you make in the piece that the entire system has benefited the people who designed it. Here's how you put it. The Trump revolt was a pushback against the winner-take-all globalization that enriched the populated coasts far more than the spaces in between. My question, since you occupy both worlds, both at Stanford and in the Central Valley, do the coasts realize this? Do they understand what this was about?
No, I don't think they do. I think when they get up in the morning, I'm in a coast right now. My op-ed column is not going to be outsourced to somebody in India. Somebody in Fresno who's a welder might lose his job. So people who do mining and logging and manufacturing and farming, the material things, they're saying to us, wait a minute, you have a granite counter in your kitchen, you have a stainless steel refrigerator, those are nice things. We make these things, and we're not outdated, and we want to look for somebody that recognizes the worth that we contribute to society. You can't eat an app all the time. And you do have to go back to the elemental essence of food and military security and housing and construction. We are the people supply it. We don't have degrees. We're not pajama boys. We don't look and sound like you people. But if you keep taking us for granted, you're going to get more of the same. And that was sort of this tragic shout back to a therapeutic culture.
Right. But it's more than take us for granted. I mean, lots of countries have seen this, the tension between the countryside and the cities. But why the loathing of the people in the cities for the people in the country?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Tucker. And that, I think, is a different subject. That is that the people on the coast or the elites never assume that they have to suffer the ramifications of their own ideology. So people are said to be xenophobic or nativist because they want a wall, and then they look at Mark Zuckerberg, who walls around his estate in Hawaii, or they say, we want reservoirs, we need water, we need dams, and the people in the coast say, well, that's so pre-industrial, we don't do that anymore. And yet San Francisco is supplied by Hetch Hetchy water transfer. So it's a sort of an anger that these people on the coast don't follow the very rules that they imply for whether it's Leonardo DiCaprio flying on a jet and then lecturing us about carbon footprints. They just don't feel that people follow the same rules that are applied to the people in the center, and then they suffer the added indignity of being called xenophobe or blinkered or knuckle draggers, and they get angry. It's an emotional response, as you say.
I live on the coast, and it makes me angry just watching it. Professor Hanson, that was really interesting. Thanks a lot for coming on tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Well, up next, tenure at universities is dying a slow death. But is that a bad thing? If college professors are all politically identical, what freedom is tenure protecting? We'll talk to a professor who is a defender of tenure. That's after the break. Looks like tenure is slowly dying in the American Academy. 40 years ago, 75% of university faculty had tenure-track posts. Now just 25% do, and they've been replaced by an army of adjunct faculty paid very low wages. But with college more expensive than ever and professors increasingly focusing on political activism and esoteric interests rather than on teaching your kids, is the decline of tenure truly to be lamented? Well, Kerry Nelson is an English professor at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. He was once also president of the American Association of University Professors and an advocate for tenure. He joins us now. Professor, thanks for coming on. So,
thank you for having me.
As I understand it, and I do understand it, and I think it makes some sense, the idea of tenure originally was to protect academic freedom. The idea was you should be able to say what you really believe on a college campus. And so if that were true, if it were working, you would see a broad diversity of thought among college professors, and yet study after study, including one just this fall, shows the opposite is true. At the top 40 colleges, Democrats outnumbered Republicans 12-1. In history departments, it was 30-1. That's not diversity. It doesn't look like America, so it's not working, is it?
Well, there's some disciplines in the humanities which aren't very politically diverse. There are other disciplines, the sciences, the technical schools, engineering, vet med, and so forth, where there's, a different range of political opinion. And frankly, in many areas of the university, especially sciences and technical schools, you wouldn't know what faculty members' political opinions are because they don't teach subject matter that's engaged with politics. So it really doesn't matter what their politics are. They're never going to express them on campus. In some disciplines, English and history, it's different.
It is different, but again,
even there,
and I'm not complaining, I'm merely saying that the point of tenure is to keep a humanities professor from being penalized for having some opinion outside of the mainstream. And my point is, what you have is total conformity even with tenure.
Actually, think about this. Let's just say that in a humanities department, English or history, a certain political correctness of political opinion reigns. How are you going to empower a few people to speak differently, to speak their minds, and to resist that prevailing opinion? If those people have no job security, if they're hired year by year on a substandard wage, they're not going to put everything at risk by disagreeing. I mean, part of what the tenure system does is protect those few faculty who have the courage to speak up honestly and resist prevailing opinion. Without tenure, then prevailing opinion, political correctness just rules and no one speaks out against it. So,
theoretically,
I think the tenure
saying,
system protects those people.
But in effect, that's not true. I mean, most of us don't have job security. I've been fired. I say whatever I feel like saying. Perhaps I'll be fired again. But the truth is that tenure protects the mediocre. And if you don't believe it, ask yourself this. Would you be willing to submit to heart surgery from a surgeon who had tenure? Would you fly in an airplane that was flown by a pilot who couldn't be fired? Of course you wouldn't, because you would presume they'd be less impressive than people who had to face the pressures of the market, right? Right.
Look, over and over again, I've seen tenured faculty either fired or forced out, or what's more painful, given some other kind of job told from now on they can't teach. They have to file books in the library, and they're not going to get a salary raise for the rest of their lives. So tenure protects job security, but it doesn't guarantee you the same responsibilities. And if you aren't performing those responsibilities at good institutions, you're shunted off to the side and you're punished severely.
But you still have an income.
And you know, when you pardon, you still have an income.
Well, sure. You have what most of us don't have.
We had a faculty member here years ago who was shunted aside, not given a raise for 20 years, and in the end, he was earning as much as a teaching assistant, a graduate student, by the time he retired. So universities can be pretty tough on tenured faculty.
But can I ask you a question?
In your lead-in, you were saying,
can I ask you an obvious question? Why, if it was so frustrating and he wasn't able to pursue his discipline in the way he felt he needed to, why didn't he leave and go somewhere else? I mean, maybe it says something about his desires, which are basically to have a sinecure and just, get a check and free meals and use the college swimming pool. I mean, doesn't that kind of say something about him? I'm not being mean, I'm being sincere.
No, I think the training for a professorship is anywhere from sort of 6 to 9 years. You then go through a tenure review process that takes another 6 years before you get tenure. And if all of that is handled properly, it's a pretty good test that you're going to be committed to your job for the rest of your life. It becomes who you are. It's what you do. And people don't want to leave the university environment because they grow up in it, they become committed to it. They really don't want any other life than that.
Apparently.
But sometimes they could do better financially if they did leave.
Ask you one.
I mean, I think.
Let me just ask you one final question. I want to go back to a question I asked earlier, and be as honest as you can be. Would you want your surgeon to be tenured? Honestly, you're going in for an operation on which your life depends. Would you want to know that that guy can't really be fired? Would you want that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I've had surgery from time to time, and I investigate the surgeon. I find out what his or her reputation is, what their, how often they operate. Tenure wouldn't be the issue. The issue would be whether that person is absolutely first rate.
Exactly. Okay.
That's, they could have job security, but I want to know if they're first rate.
Of course you would, because you're not crazy.
Oh,
I'm sorry, Professor, we're out of time, but I agree with you on that one. You care about if they're good. Thanks for joining us. We'll be right back.